How Octavian became emperor. So the story of Octavian begins in the year 49 BC with Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar in the year 49 BC was the governor of Illyricum and Gaul. And by the year 49, his term as governor had come to an end, and he attempted to continue his career and to make a deal with the Senate, which would allow him to either continue as governor of one of the provinces or to run as consul. But the Senate rejected Caesar's requests. Now, Caesar had spent his whole entire life as a general and a politician. He had spent many years, many decades of his life making deals with various politicians, factions, and individuals. And the last successful agreement or deal he was able to reach was at the Lucca Conference several years earlier. And even before that, when the first triumvirate uh, started, Caesar was able to work out a negotiation and make a deal with Pompey and Crassus, and everybody was able to get something that they wanted, and they were able to get along. But by the year 49, the Senate was not going to allow Caesar to continue, and so Caesar crossed the Rubicon, took his army, crossed the Rubicon, and marched on Rome. And after all of the battles and campaigns that he took part in, Caesar eventually conquered the Roman Republic. And so after Caesar's last battle uh, in Spain, at the Battle of Mutina, Caesar destroyed the last army or military forces that the Roman Republic had. Caesar had victory, and the Civil War, Caesar's Civil War, had lasted about 5 years from uh, 49, the year 49, to about 45, and then 44 when he was assassinated. And so after the Battle of Mutina, Caesar went back to Rome, made himself dictator for life, uh, and basically remained unchallenged. He couldn't be removed. He uh, almost had absolute power, basically, and he couldn't be removed. He didn't have a time limit, and he was just going to, or was supposed to be, for him at least, he was supposed to be dictator indefinitely. And so during the Civil War, Caesar had defeated time and time again many of the Roman Republic's armies, and the generals and politicians uh, that had sided with Pompey and the other Roman Republic forces. Caesar spared many of their lives, and so many of the governors and senators, they went back after the Civil War ended, and many of them ended up turning and assassinating Caesar in 44 BC. And so it was at this time, after Caesar had died, where there was a power gap, or there was an opening of who would be running things. And so that's where Octavian first comes into the picture. Julius Caesar did not have an heir, and so when Caesar died in 44, his heir, he left everything to, or mostly everything, to his nephew, um, Octavian. And Octavian at the time was not in Italy. He was away, uh, learning how to do things in the military, how to be a leader and command. He was away getting an education, how to speak, how to engage in politics and so forth. And so Octavian uh, was not there in 44. And so Mark Antony, who was also the consul that year, he was able to retain or keep his power. Many of the conspirators or the assassins who had killed Caesar also survived, and many of them were able to escape the city. Caesar had many supporters among the people, and so during Caesar's funeral, Mark Antony gave a speech and was able to make many of the people rise up and go after Caesar's assassins. And so many of Caesar's assassins had to leave Italy, leave Rome, and flee for their lives. And so Octavian, after he had found out he had, Caesar had died and he had become Caesar's heir to get his estates, his wealth, and so forth, Octavian went back to Italy, went back to Rome. And many of Caesar's assassins fled and went east to raise an army to fight Mark Antony. And so now you had Mark Antony, and he was a consul in 44. He was a consul of the for the Romans, uh, and his term, the term as the consul, was only for 1 year. And so after the year or his term was up, normally a consul would become a proconsul, or basically they would be given a province to go be governor of. And so the Senate offered to give Mark Antony to let him go be governor of Macedonia or Syria, but Mark Antony refused. He didn't want to go be governor of Macedonia. He wanted to go be the governor in Gaul, in Cisalpine Gaul. But Cisalpine Gaul already had a governor. Uh, his name was Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, a different Brutus. And so Cisalpine Gaul already had a governor. And so Mark Antony said, well, why don't you go be governor somewhere else? Go be governor in Macedonia or somewhere else. I want to be governor of Cisalpine Gaul. Because Mark Antony knew that since Brutus and Cassius and several other of Caesar's assassins had escaped after killing Caesar and were out east raising an army, that Mark Antony, he would need his own army. And so he wanted to be governor in at least part of Gaul, because that way he could recruit soldiers, and many of the people there, many of the soldiers and citizens already knew him. But the governor, who was there already, refused. So Mark Antony went north and laid siege to the city of Mutina with his army. Now, while all this was going on, Octavian had come back to Italy, had come back to Rome, and at first he wasn't too involved in the politics, but rather he went around and started raising his own army. Now, Caesar, before he was assassinated, he had gotten tired of Rome and dealing with the politics, and he was getting ready to go east to launch a campaign in Dacia or against Parthia, and to go be like his hero Alexander the Great. But since that never happened because he was assassinated, much of the army or the wealth that he had built up to do that was never used for that, or not used for that. And so Octavian shows up, and he decided to recruit many of these soldiers, or many of Caesar's soldiers. And so Mark Antony was up north in northern Italy with his army, laying siege to Mutina, trying to forcibly remove the Roman governor that was there and take over the province for himself. And then Octavian, he shows up and he raises his own army with much of the wealth that he had inherited or borrowed, um, and so Octavian raised his own army, which he wasn't supposed to do, but he did anyway. And so Octavian, he took his army, and the Senate didn't really have an answer for Mark Antony, and so Octavian shows up with his army, and with the blessing of the Senate, and even many in the Senate joining Octavian, Octavian himself took his army and went north to meet Mark Antony and to stop Mark Antony and his army from trying to take over the province in the north, in Cisalpine Gaul. And so Octavian, with the blessing of the Senate and even many of the senators supporting him and even joining him, the two new Roman consuls for that year also joined Octavian. Octavian went north, and he went to stop Mark Antony. And at the battle of the Forum Gallorum, Octavian and Mark Antony met, but the battle was indecisive. It was kind of a draw, and so Octavian and Mark Antony again uh, met each other and had a battle at the Battle of Mutina itself. And again, the battle was inconclusive. It was undecisive. Both sides took huge losses, heavy losses, but there wasn't a clear outcome or a winner. Both sides, it basically ended in a draw. However, after these two major engagements, Mark Antony had taken some serious losses. Octavian had taken some losses, many losses. Uh, and Mark Antony decided he needed time to regroup. He needed more soldiers, more men. And so Mark Antony lifted the siege, or he stopped the siege of Mutina, and he went west to the other parts of Gaul to raise soldiers, to raise more people, more legions for his army. So Mark Antony, with his army intact, he retreated or went to southern Gaul. Now, the governor who was there at the time, the governor of southern Gaul and Spain at the time, was a guy called Lepidus. And so Mark Antony shows up after these major battles and engagements with Octavian. Mark Antony shows up in southern Gaul, and many of the soldiers, or the garrisons and the army and legion that were stationed there, defected and switched sides or joined Mark Antony. They didn't offer him resistance, and that's not surprising considering how many years that Mark Antony had spent in Gaul uh, during the Gallic Wars with Julius Caesar. And so Lepidus and many of the soldiers and people that was there, including himself, Lepidus, joined Mark Antony. Now, it was at this time, and after all these battles, that the two Roman consuls that were with Octavian had both died in the engagements that had been going on and taking place in northern Italy. And so there was no Roman consuls. And so Octavian, what he did is he ceased operations and hostilities against Mark Antony, partly because Octavian himself had taken some serious losses. And Octavian sent a message to the Senate, or he sent a message to Rome that um, he wanted to be consul, since both of the consuls for that year were killed in battle. Octavian, he wanted to be the consul. And also, since Octavian had stopped battling or fighting against Mark Antony, he wanted the Senate to drop any charges against Mark Antony. Everything was supposed to go back to normal, and everything was supposed to be good. To not outlaw Mark Antony, to not consider him a criminal. And the Senate turned him down, turned down Octavian. So Octavian turned his army around and went back to Rome and wiped out almost anybody who was his enemy or political opposition. No different than Sulla had done with the proscriptions when Sulla had marched on Rome and wiped out or executed anybody who would be a threat to his power. Well, here Octavian did the same. And also around this time, it was around this time that the two main assassins of Caesar, Brutus and Cassius, were away in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, in Syria and in Greece and in that area, raising their own army to fight Mark Antony and now also Octavian. So Octavian and Mark Antony met, and they decided that they were going to make a deal to be, which has also been called the Second Triumvirate, between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. They were all going to join forces in the west, and they all combined their strength, all their legions, their armies, to face Brutus and Cassius, who were raising their own army, their own military forces in the east, and were heading west to meet them. So Mark Antony and Octavian reconciled and prepared to meet and engage um, Brutus and Cassius, who were coming from the east. And so, also while this was going on, Octavian married Clodia Pulchra from 42 to 40. And she was the daughter of Mark Antony's wife, but was the daughter from a previous marriage. And so Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus all teamed up and joined forces against to join forces to go against Brutus and Cassius, who were advancing from the east with their army, and would have easily wiped all of them out separately had they continued to fight amongst each other and to squabble over small engagements. They would have been easily wiped out because Brutus and Cassius had raised a huge army and were coming back to restore the Roman Republic and to get rid of all the dictators, all of the emperors, and so forth, and go back to try to bring back and go back to a time when there was elections and the consuls and the Senate would have the power instead of just one person, such as Mark Antony and Octavian and so forth. And so while all this was going on, another major player showed up or came onto the scene, and that was Sextus Pompey. Now, Sextus Pompey was the son of Pompey, or Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great. And his story is also pretty interesting. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon and went to take over, uh, Pompey and his son, Sextus Pompey, fled Rome and went to Greece. And after Caesar went there and defeated uh, his dad, Pompey, at the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey then went to Egypt but was assassinated. And after that, his son, Sextus Pompey, continued to fight against Julius Caesar, and so he went to Africa to join the Roman Republic's forces that were there. And after Caesar conquered and defeated the guys who were in an army that was in Africa, Sextus went to Spain and joined the Roman Republic forces, an army that was stationed there. And after um, Caesar went to Spain and defeated that army, that last army, at the Battle of Mutina, Sextus Pompey laid low because there was basically nowhere else to go at that point, and pretty much laid low for a while. And then after Caesar was assassinated in 44, Pompey, he went down to Sicily and took the island over for himself. And he had some naval forces, and he also was able to take over Sardinia and Corsica. Now, while this was going on, it was during this time of the Second Triumvirate. Octavian and Mark Antony had joined forces in Lepidus to face off against the bigger threat, which was coming from Brutus and Cassius. That was the last major effort to restore the Republic, to bring back elections, give power to the consuls and to the Senate instead of having it in one man with the emperor or dictator. And so Sextus Pompey was down in Sicily. He had his fleet, he had a navy, and was building up his army. And so he was considered the lesser threat. And so Octavian and Mark Antony ignored him for the time being. And so with their combined strength and their combined armies, Octavian and Mark Antony went east, and at the Battle of Philippi in Greece, met the armies of Brutus and Cassius and defeated them at the Battle of Philippi. And so at the Battle of Philippi, the Second Triumvirate, or Mark Antony and Octavian, defeated Brutus and Cassius, and that was the last time, or the last major effort to restore the Roman Republic. And so after that battle, Mark Antony and Octavian basically divided up the Roman Empire between themselves and also Lepidus. Octavian was the governor, or took over Spain. Lepidus was able to have Africa, and Mark Antony had almost most of the Roman territories. Mark Antony had the eastern parts of the Mediterranean, and also Gaul and Illyricum. Mark Antony's governor in Gaul was a guy called Quintus Fufius Calenus, and he would play a somewhat significant role in the next couple of years that would affect the balance of power, at least in the Western Mediterranean, along with Lepidus. And so the Second Triumvirate divided up the Roman territories amongst themselves, and in theory, everyone was supposed to have access to Italy, but it ended up that Octavian was the main guy there, and so he was the guy who mostly ran things. Now, after Brutus and Cassius were defeated, there was still at least kind of, sort of, the idea or hope that the Roman Republic could still be restored and saved from the dictatorship or the Second Triumvirate, the various rulers, the Caesarian faction, with Sextus Pompey, who was down in Sicily. He was building up his navy, building up his army, and with his ships, with his fleet, and with his sailors and soldiers, he was able to go around and intercept many of the ships and basically be kind of a pirate and intercept many of the grain shipments that were coming up from Egypt or Africa or elsewhere and were going towards Rome or Italy and other places. And so that could cause a huge problem by intercepting many of the merchant ships, intercepting many of the ships that were carrying wheat and grain and other foodstuffs back to Italy. After the Battle of Philippi, there had been an enormous number of casualties on both sides. The fighting had been fierce, and as that civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony and Brutus and Lepidus, or not Lepidus, Cassius, came to a close and ended, both sides had been really exhausted, many casualties, many deaths, and so everybody needed a little bit of time to regroup, to reorganize, and rebuild their devastated armies that had taken enormous losses. So Mark Antony went east, Octavian went back to Rome, Lepidus went to Africa and became the governor there. And so Octavian, he needed time to rebuild his forces, and Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey Magnus, who was down in Sicily, he also needed time to build up his navy, build up his fleet, and build up his army. And so there was this kind of lull or truce that needed to happen, which did happen, and both sides got together, Octavian and the Second Triumvirate and Sextus Pompey, and they basically made a deal or made a agreement where both sides would leave each other alone, at least for a while. And so there was a brief period of peace. And also, this is just a couple years after the Battle of Philippi. Philippi was in 42 BC, and that brings up the next major event to go down. And so about 1 or 2 years after the Battle of Philippi, Octavian, he had his army, and since supposedly there was going to be peace, at least Sextus Pompey would stop raiding ships, stop interrupting the wheat and grain coming from Egypt and Africa, which was the cura annone, or the food stamps they had 2,000 years ago, bread and circus. And so there was a brief period of peace. Trade, commerce, merchants and ships could go without being intercepted or looted and so forth. And so Octavian, he needed land. One of the things he wanted to do was give his soldiers land, since they weren't really needed, at least at the time being. So he wanted to give them land, because, you know, having an army, having soldiers is a very expensive thing to do. And so Octavian, he needed land for his soldiers. Since the war was over, or supposedly over, things were going to go back to normal, everything was all going to be good and dandy. But that didn't exactly happen. the major years for this time were 41 BC and 40 BC. And so Octavian took land from the wealthy and the aristocrats or the rich, and he gave it to his soldiers because there wasn't really too much land at the time available. And so Octavian would rather have angry, wealthy, and aristocrats than angry soldiers who might support or side with someone who would look after them or take care of their needs. And so Octavian took away all this land from the wealthy, and he gave it to his soldiers. And also, Octavian divorced his wife, Claudia Potra, who was the daughter of Mark Antony's wife, Fulvia. And Octavian married a woman called, in his second marriage, called Scribonia, who was the niece of Sextus Pompey's wife. That was one of the things that Octavian did in order to get peace with Sextus Pompey. Both sides needed time to build up their armies and their military forces, and so that was one of the things Octavian did. Now, Sextus Pompey's wife her name was also Scribonia, but it was a different Scribonia. So Octavian's wife, Scribonia, was the niece of Sextus Pompey's wife. And that marriage lasted from 40 to 38. And so what Octavian did was extremely unpopular with the rich and the wealthy landowners. They had just lost a lot of their land, and they decided that they were going to make a move against Octavian. But they didn't really even consider or bother raising their own force, because Octavian had this huge army. Anyway, so Mark Antony's brother was Lucius Antonius, or Lucius Antony, and he just happened to be the governor in that year, for the year 41. And Mark Antony's brother and Mark Antony's wife, Fulvia, joined with the rich and wealthy aristocrats and decided that they were going to try to take down Octavian. So they revolted, they gathered what forces they could, raised something of an army. But Octavian quickly gathered his army, or his forces, and went down to Rome and drove them out. Now, after Mark Antony's brother Lucius and Mark Antony's wife Fulvia, who were leading this rebellion or this revolt, after Octavian drove them from Rome, they fled the city and they went to a city in Italy called Perusia, which is kind of in the center and in the north. So Octavian, he took his army and went to Perusia, laid siege to the city, and took it back and wiped them out, wiped out the rebellion. Now, when Octavian took the city of Perusia, he spared the life of Mark Antony's brother, and also Fulvia was able to leave or get away, and later went to Greece, or left Italy. And Octavian did that because he was in a very precarious situation at that time. Uh, there was the fear that Mark Antony could move against Octavian from the east, and Mark Antony's governor or his army and legions in Gaul could also move against or come down from the north against them. And so Octavian, he spared Mark Antony's brother's life, and he sent him away to go be governor in Spain. Now, during this huge upheaval, uh, Mark Antony was, during this time, he was away in the east, and he was preparing to go to war with Parthia, with the Parthian Empire, to go conquer Parthia and go to India and take over India, just like Alexander the Great did. But with all this happening, with all this going on, Mark Antony put his invasion plans on hold, and Mark Antony did go back west to go deal with this major event. And when his brother and his wife Fulvia tried to seize power for themselves, and it failed, Mark Antony and Octavian did meet, and they both decided to work out a new deal to continue the second triumvirate, and everything would be good. Everybody would go back to being normal. It was also during this time that Mark Antony's governor in Gaul and Illyricum, Quintus Fufius Calenus, died in 40 BC. And so the legions, after his death, the legions and the territory, Octavian basically went in and took over. And so he had that territory now instead of Mark Antony. And also there was still the threat from Sextus Pompeius coming from Sicily. That had to be dealt with at some point because the fighting and the raiding and the ships and the wheat and grain and so forth that were being started to be intercepted again, and Sextus wanted to try to restore the Roman Republic, but at this point he didn't really have the power base he needed to do that, but he tried anyway. And so Octavian and Mark Antony made a deal. They decided to continue the second triumvirate, and Octavian would, at least supposedly, this is what was supposed to happen with the new deal, with this new agreement. Octavian would send soldiers and troops east to help Mark Antony's conquest or war with Parthia, and Mark Antony would send some ships west to help Octavian deal with Pompey and Sicily. Mark Antony did send some ships, and Octavian did send some soldiers east, but they weren't the amount that Mark Antony needed. He was expecting about at least 10 or 20,000, and Octavian only sent about 1,000 or 2,000, barely anything, and they didn't even get there until after the invasion or Mark Antony's war with Parthia, until it was all over. Now, with the second triumvirate, when Octavian would rule in the west, when Mark Antony would rule in the east, and Lepidus would rule in Africa, it wasn't exactly like that. When Mark Antony did go out east, and when Lepidus did go to Africa, they did control many areas, many territories and cities. But when the Roman Empire was first starting out, they had inherited the system from the late or towards the end of the Roman Republic. And so when the Roman Empire was first starting, many of the Roman territories weren't exactly Roman at all, even. For example, there was many kingdoms and client states that existed. They had their own king or their own queen, and they kind of were, to a certain extent, to a certain degree, allowed to do their own thing. For example, some of these kingdoms or client states that existed within the Roman Empire in the beginning were various kingdoms such as the kingdom of Mauritania, Numidia, Egypt, Judea, Galatia, the Bosporan kingdom, the kingdom of Thrace, and others. And to a certain degree, they were allowed to do, they would have their own king or their own queen, and they were allowed to have their own guy running things. And the Romans would engage in commerce and trade, and mostly, at least at first, they would send mercenaries. These various kingdoms and client states, the Romans would ask for soldiers or cavalry for their legion or their army, and these kings and the various kingdoms or client states, they would send soldiers or especially cavalry, because much of the Roman cavalry was not that wasn't that good or very effective, and so they would rely on many of these mercenaries or client states to send them guys to go fight with them. And so Mark Antony wanted to invade the Parthian Empire, and the Parthian Empire 2,000 years ago was one of the world's greatest superpowers in its day. It was one of the most powerfulest countries and had one of the greatest militaries that ever existed. Now, the Parthian Empire went from about the Pakistan and India to in the east to Iraq and that area in the west. And also it had various client states, especially later on with the Sassanid Empire in the Arabian Peninsula. And so Mark Antony and Octavian made a deal. They renewed the second triumvirate and basically tried to get things back to normal. Octavian stayed in the west, continued doing his thing, and Mark Antony, he left and went back east. Although this time, Mark Antony married the daughter of, or not the daughter of, but the sister of Octavian, Octavia. And so he was married to her for a while. Mark Antony at that point didn't want to have a conflict with Octavian in the west at that time. He was building up his forces and he was getting ready to invade Parthia. But what happened before all that was in itself pretty interesting. Okay, so let me rewind or back up a little bit. Okay, so in the year 42 BC, at the Battle of Philippi, Mark Antony and Octavian defeated one of the last major push or attempt to restore or bring back the Roman Republic and to end the dictatorship or the emperors and the second triumvirate. That failed. And so after the Battle of Philippi, Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian divided up the Roman Empire. Octavian controlled part of the west, Mark Antony controlled the east, and Lepidus was down in Africa. Each had his own thing going, a little piece of land for each of them. And So Mark Antony, after that civil war was over and done with, was going to invade and try to take over the Parthian Empire. And the Parthian Empire was one of the richest countries in the world. Many of the much of the Silk Road went through Parthia, um, from China and India, where also trade was going on. And during wartime or uh, other disruptions that may have been going on, such as famine or pestilence that made trade particularly hazardous by land, the Romans also engaged in sea trade with India through various ports in Eastern Europe, or not Eastern Europe, Eastern Egypt, excuse me. They would have their ships sail down the Red Sea out to the Arabian Sea, and then from there they would go to India and back, or China or elsewhere. So the Silk Road was not necessarily uh, on land, but also by sea trade and by sea routes. And so that was one of the most valuablest goods and products, trade routes in existence. And even today, I mean, a lot of trade goes on with China and various other countries, and it was the same 2,000 years ago. And so Mark Antony wanted a piece of that. He wanted to try to take over Parthia, try to take over India, like Alexander the Great, and then maybe China or elsewhere. And so after Philippi, the Battle of Philippi, Mark Antony went east, and he needed time, though, before invading the kingdom or the empire of Parthia. Mark Antony, he needed time because after Philippi, many of his troops were worn out. Mark Antony had taken huge losses at the Battle of Philippi, and so he needed time to reorganize, to regroup his army, to get more soldiers, replacements. He needed more money, more wealth. And so one of the things Mark Antony did is he went to Egypt and also asked for help from the various governors and kings that the Romans had, the various client kingdoms and client states in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Mark Antony asked them for help to send soldiers, troops, supplies, and so forth for the upcoming campaign against Parthia. So Mark Antony was building up this huge army, this huge military force to try to take over the Parthian kingdom, the Parthian Empire. And so that's exactly what he did. He had this huge force ready to go in Syria, uh, and then it ended up that Mark Antony decided that he was going to postpone the invasion of Parthia, and he went south to Egypt to hang out with Cleopatra. Now, during this time, the Parthian Empire obviously wasn't oblivious to what was going on. They knew that they were going to get invaded. They knew they were going to be invaded eventually at some point. And so Mark Antony postpones this invasion and goes back to Egypt to hang out with Cleopatra. And so the Parthians, they seized the initiative, and the Parthians took their army, and they went on the attack. Now, or they did a preemptive strike. Now, the Parthians had a pretty influential or somewhat important Roman on their side, a guy called Quintus Labienus. Now, he was the son of Titus Labienus, who was one of Caesar's generals in Gaul during the Gallic Wars, one of Julius Caesar's most successful generals. But during the Civil War, after Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Labienus switched sides. He went over to Pompey and the Senate, and he fought for the Roman Republic against Caesar, and eventually died at I want to say, the Battle of Munda. Now, his son, Quintus Labienus, later on, after Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Quintus Labienus joined the liberators, or Brutus and Cassius, who wanted to fight with them and to help them try to restore the Roman Republic against Octavian and Mark Antony. And so what Quintus Labienus did during that conflict is he was a diplomat, and he went to Parthia, the Parthian Empire, and he asked the Parthian king for help, uh, supplies, money, wealth, even some troops to go fight with or for Brutus and Cassius. And so that's what he did as a diplomat. And of course, at the Battle of Philippi, Brutus and Cassius were defeated. It was a failure. But Quintus Labienus, he stayed in Parthia. And at this stage in the game, Parthia saw him as a pretty valuable asset and made him a general, one of the Parthian generals, to go and help them with the attack. And so the Parthians, while Mark Antony was away, or down in Egypt, the Parthians launched a full-scale attack with their army against the Romans in Syria and elsewhere. And the Romans were caught off guard and kind of unprepared, because they were the ones who were supposed to be doing the invading, and now here they were on the defensive. And leading this attack was one of the I don't want to say a major player, but at least a minor player, with Quintus Labienus, who was helping the Parthians take over. And so the Parthians went to Syria, and the prince, the Parthian crown prince, or the heir to the Parthian king, a man whose name was Pacorus I, was also there, and also with them, with the Parthian army, marching into Syria. And the Parthians first went to a place called Apamea, which was a city in Syria. And at the Battle of Apamea, the first attack failed. The Romans were able to repulse the Parthian army, which was composed of mainly cavalry, which is what the Parthians specialized in, compared to the Romans, which were mostly specialized in heavy infantry. And so this first attack on this city, or this place, failed. And so what Quintus Labienus did is he went around, and he was able to get many of the Romans in Syria to defect to the Parthian side, or to switch sides. And one of the ways that was able to work and succeed is because many of the Roman soldiers in Syria had formerly fought for the Roman Republic, and also for Brutus and Cassius. They had fought for the Roman Republic and been in their armies. And so Quintus Labienus went around and was able to get many of those garrisons and soldiers to defect. And so the Parthians, and with the soldiers Quintus Labienus was able to pick up and get, the Parthians launched a second attack on Apamea, and the second attack succeeded. After that, the Parthians went to the city of Antioch, and laid siege and captured Antioch. Now the Parthians, or the Persians, had not been in Antioch for about 300 years since Alexander the Great uh, took the city, hundreds of years before. And so the Parthians took over Syria. Next, the Parthians divided their army, they divided their force. They had a huge military, a huge army with them. And Pacorus, or the Parthian prince, went south to Judea and was welcomed by the people there, the Jews, who in particular hated the Romans. And so the Roman puppet king or client king in Judea was deposed or taken down, and a pro-Parthian king was put into Judea. Parthians were welcomed there. The other half of the Parthian army went with Quintus Labienus, and he started moving north into the land and areas of what is modern-day Turkey. But at the time was various small client kingdoms and client states, such as Galatia and several other ones. And so this had turned into a full-scale disaster for Mark Antony and the Romans. And to top it off, when Mark Antony found out what was going on, at this point, the Parthians, if they had wanted to, could have even launched an attack into Egypt itself. This was a complete disaster and catastrophe. Labienus was already moving north, and he was moving west and going pretty quick. Now, at this point, Mark Antony did respond, but not exactly in a way you would expect. Mark Antony did leave Egypt. He did head north. He stayed there only a while, though, because in the west, what was going on is Mark Antony's brother and his wife, Fulvia, had launched a coup again, or tried to launch a coup against Octavian, and so fighting was going on in Italy. A lot of stuff was going on, and so Mark Antony, instead of dealing with this Parthian invasion, he left one of his generals or officers and lieutenants. He left them in charge, and Octavian sailed away or went west to go deal with the crisis that was going on with his brother and wife in Italy with Octavian. But this was at this point, this was a pretty bad situation. Now, the Parthians had deposed in Judea. They had deposed the Roman friendly king there, King Hyrcanus II, and the Parthians, or the Parthian prince, he replaced him with a guy called King Antigonus. Or I'm probably saying that completely wrong. But the new king was friendly to Parthia, and so all of a sudden, Syria was gone. Mark Antony had lost Syria, and the Parthians were now moving into Turkey and other Roman territories. Now, the general or lieutenant or governor that Mark Antony decided to leave in charge of this disaster and mess was a guy called Publius Vendidius Bassus. He was one of Mark Antony's main guys. And so he was left to deal with this while Mark Antony was away in the west, dealing with the crisis going on there. And so what this guy did is he was able to delay the Parthian advance, or at least the Parthian advance in the north that was being led by Quintus Labienus. And so one of the reasons that Mark Antony and Octavian decided to continue the Second Triumvirate and not battle it out with each other was because of this developing disaster and situation that was going on. This was a complete catastrophe going on. And so Mark Antony, instead of having to take what forces he had left in the Eastern Roman Empire and head west to fight Octavian, he was then able to send them east. But while this was going on, Mark Antony wasn't there, he was away, and he left one of his main generals, Publius Vendidius Bassus, to take care of the situation. And so Mark Antony's general, he went north and took the army he had with them, and he met the Parthians and Quintus Labienus, who were advancing further and further into Roman territory, and he met them at the Battle of the Sicilian Gates. Now, this battle took place on a hill. What Mark Antony's general did is he took his soldiers and he put them on a mountain, on a hill. Now, Quintus Labienus, he decided that he was going to send his force, he was going to send the Parthians up this hill to engage the Roman infantry. Now, the Parthians were not very good at times when it came to large-scale infantry battles. They were mostly cavalry-based. They had horse archers, and they had cataphract cavalry, which were cavalrymen who were completely covered in armor, head to toe. The horse was covered in armor. It was almost like a knight from the Middle Ages. And so Labienus, he decided he was going to attack Mark Antony's force up this hill. Mark Antony's general was waiting for him. And so obviously the cavalry or the horses would not be able to move very fast, and were just not very good at maneuvering and going uphill, because that's not what cavalry is very good at. Cavalry, in order to be effective, especially Parthian cavalry, they would do hit and run tactics. They would use their horse archers to fire arrows at a distance, retreat, then go back and fire some more arrows, retreat. And so it would be hit and run tactics. But anyway, that's what Labienus, he tried to do. He sent these cavalry, and so they were going uphill but very slowly. The Romans the Romans that Mark Antony had, his soldiers were able to withstand the attack and also rain down spears, pila, and other. Mark Antony also had archers with him, as one of the things he did before getting ready to invade Parthia is he looked at Crassus's mistake, which had happened several decades before, where the Roman army tried to take over Parthia and had gotten wiped out. So Mark Antony, he raised a bunch of slingers and archers to counteract the Parthian archers. And then Mark Antony's infantry charged down this hill and wiped out the Parthian cavalry. And when they reached the bottom of the hill, they met the cataphract, the heavy Parthian cavalry, who made a pretty good stand. But again, the cavalry does not do very well in a prolonged infantry engagement. That's not what it's designed to do. Cavalry is designed to do a quick flanking attack, attack from the back, do a shock frontal attack. I mean, it's not good to have cavalry engage in a prolonged infantry attack, especially going uphill. That's not what it's designed to do. And so at that battle, the Battle of Sicilian Gates, Mark Antony's general was victorious. Labienus survived the battle. He tried to escape but was captured and then later executed. And so that put a halt to the Parthian advance and attack on Roman territory. And so after that Parthian army had been lost and had been defeated, Publius took his army and he went to engage another Parthian force that was somewhat nearby and was guarding a mountain pass that would lead into one of the ways to get to Syria, back to Syria. And so the Parthians, they had set up this small force to try to delay and prevent the Romans from launching an attack and trying to take back Syria. And they made their stand, the Parthians made their stand at a place called Amanus Pass. And this was a pretty good place to have a defensive battle. You have to remember a mountain pass is narrow, not a whole lot of room to maneuver. And plus the Parthians, they still had these expert cavalry archers, and also some of the heavier cavalry with the cataphracts, fully armored. And so the Romans, with Mark Antony's general Publius, at this battle of the Amanus Pass to try to get back to Syria, to try to reclaim the lost territory that the Parthians had taken. And they had a battle there at this mountain pass. And so what the Roman general did, Publius, is he to get the Parthians to abandon their really in a good defensive position. What he did is he had some of the lighter Roman cavalry, which wasn't very good at times, had little or no armor. The horse had little or no armor. The cavalryman had little or no armor. And generally wasn't as good as the Parthian cavalry, at least during that time. And so he had these light Roman cavalry out in the open. So the Parthians, they saw this Roman cavalry force, and they knew it wasn't very good. And so the Parthians charged out from their really good defensive position. They went out to pursue or meet this Roman cavalry, this light Roman cavalry. And after that happened, both sides engaged, and the Romans had some hidden guys that they were able to go around the flanks and basically wipe out the Parthians there. And so now this second Parthian force had been wiped out, and the Romans, or Mark Antony's general Publius, was now able to go into Syria itself and try to recapture it. Now at this point, the Parthian prince Pacorus, he saw what was going on, and so he took what force he had, or the rest of his army that he had, and headed north into Syria to meet the attack by the Romans. And both sides met, the Parthians and the Romans met at the Battle of Mount Gindarus. And once again, for some reason, the Romans were on a hill there, and for some reason, once again, the Parthians tried attacking, going uphill, and were defeated. It was a complete disaster, and the Parthian army there was wiped out, destroyed. And even Pacorus himself, the heir to Parthia, or the Parthian king, was killed in that battle. And so, after that happened, the Romans were able to retake Syria, and later on they also went back down to Judea and they got rid of the Parthian friendly king there, and were able to put a And that's where actually King Herod comes from. He was put. King Herod was installed and as the Roman-friendly king, and the Parthian guy who was put there, Antigonus, they deposed of him. Now, while all this happened, Mark Antony was not here. He was not. He was not there. And when he did finally get back, uh, Publius, his general, who he had left in charge as the general and the governor and so forth, had all these successes and saved the Eastern Roman Empire, or part of it at least. And Mark Antony thanked him and basically couldn't stand that he didn't have the glory. And so Mark Antony, when he got back from the West, dealing with the disaster and crisis going on there, he removed Publius from command and sent him back to Rome. And so one of Mark Antony's most capable guys, most successful generals, he got rid of him. So at this point, Mark Antony he needed some time after this catastrophe and catastrophic failure that had gone on. He needed time to rebuild his army, so that's what he did again. So he had to build yet another army, replace the losses he had, rebuild his force, and get ready to invade Parthia, which is what he did next after he was able to regroup and reorganize from the last disaster. But the Parthians, after all this had gone down, after all this had gone on, the Parthians had bought themselves some time, and that's exactly what they needed, and one of the reasons they did that, and that's exactly what would pay off in the long term for them. Okay, and so at this point, Mark Antony was ready to finally invade Parthia. And he had rebuilt his army, and so he had several options. He could have advanced through the open areas, through the desert, and attacked Parthia that way. But Mark Antony had learned from Crassus, who did that several decades before. And what happened is the Roman army went through those deserts or open areas, which is exactly the type of terrain and land that cavalry does the best on, flat land, out in the open areas. And what happened is several decades before, the Roman general and politician Crassus had taken his Roman army and marched into Parthia over those flat and open areas. And basically what happened at the Battle of Carrhae is the Romans got surrounded by the Parthian cavalry, and the Parthian horse archers just rained down arrows on them day and night, all the time. All that constant bombardment of arrows until eventually the Romans gave up, were defeated, captured, killed, and so forth. The Romans with Crassus, they did have a little bit of cavalry. They sent them out to pursue the Parthian horse archers. But what the Parthians did, the Parthian cavalry ran away, and so the Roman cavalry pursued them. When the Roman cavalry got far enough away and too far away from the main force, the main infantry force, the Parthians turned around and wiped them out. And the Parthians also had the heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, the Romans basically for a long time they didn't have an answer to that, or they didn't really have a response to the Parthian cavalry. And so after Crassus's army had been defeated and destroyed, the Roman cavalry had been wiped out, and then the infantry, they were out in the middle of a desert, little or no terrain features. There was no nearby water supply. Many of the dudes just gave up, or many of them left or were captured. Some were able to escape during the night. Crassus himself was captured. His army gave up or was defeated. and that was the end of the first Roman attempt to take over Parthia. There was many more attempts, and this latest one with Mark Antony was no different. And so Mark Antony, he learned from that, and so he decided that instead of going over the open terrain, desert area, that he would go through Armenia. He would go through the north, and he would attack Parthia through the mountains, through the forest, through hilly terrain where it's not very good for cavalry. Cavalry can't really maneuver on mountains. And so Mark Antony, he decided he was going to move his army through the mountains so that he would have a better time dealing with the Parthians. Now, the king of Armenia did not like the Parthians either, and so joined the Romans and helped the Romans when Mark Antony went through, teamed up with them, and went south to deal with the Parthians. The Armenians did not like the Parthians. They had pretty good cavalry themselves, the Armenians, and pretty good military forces themselves. Armenia had offered their help and assistance to Crassus decades before, but Crassus turned them down. This time, however, Mark Antony accepted the Armenian king's aid or offer of help. And so the Romans and Armenians had an alliance, and they both teamed up, joined their military forces, and both went down to invade and take over the Parthians. Now, Armenia was for a long time, was a very strategic place, even after this. And changed from, depending on what era it was, Armenia was either a Roman province or territory, a client state, or they had an alliance with them. And so throughout hundreds of years of the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire, Armenia switched sides, changed sides. Sometimes the Armenian king would, when the Parthians had the upper hand, the Parthians would install a king that would be friendly to them. And eventually, Armenia was taken over by the Parthians, or later the Sassanids. But that was hundreds of years later. And the main reason Armenia was so strategic to both the Romans and the Parthians is because whoever controlled Armenia would not have to station military forces on that border to expect an attack from the Armenians from that side, and they could focus all their attention on either Syria or Iraq. And so Armenia was very strategic for both sides, and that would continue for hundreds of years. But anyway, back to Mark Antony's invasion of Parthia. So Mark Antony, he went through the north, and the Parthians, like the Romans, and like Armenia, the Parthian Empire also had client states. And one of those was the kingdom of, you see here, Media. That's what it was. The kingdom of Media. Atropatene. I know I'm probably saying that wrong. And that kingdom was in the northwestern part of the Parthian Empire. And they were friendly and allied with the Parthians. And the client king, or the client state, was ruled by a guy called Artavasdes I. Now, not to be confused with, but the king of Armenia who helped Mark Antony, his name also was Artavasdes, Artavasdes II of Armenia. So they both may have had the same name, but they were different kings and they ruled different countries. And so Mark Antony, he went north through the mountains, through Armenia, and he attacked this client state. And what was supposed to happen is this was supposed to be a quick takeover, and then he would move on to the next Parthian territory. However, that's not what happened. In fact, there isn't really too much to describe about Mark Antony's invasion of Parthia because not a whole lot went on, and I'll explain in a minute. It was actually another one of Mark Antony's. It ended up being a huge embarrassment to Mark Antony because no major engagement or battle actually took place. Okay, so why did Mark Antony go to this Parthian client state? Well, the capital of Media, or the Parthian client kingdom, the capital there was a city called Pharaspa. I'm probably saying that wrong. And why did Mark Antony go there? Well, he probably wanted to try to get any gold or wealth and other valuables and resources he could find there. Also, it would be strategic to take over the capital. I mean, losing a capital is a pretty big thing, even if it's just for a client kingdom. And so after that, Mark Antony was supposed to take this over. It was supposed to be really quick, really easy, really simple. But that's not what happened at all. So Mark Antony crossed the Parthian border from Armenia, and he entered the Parthian lands, or this client kingdom of Media. And Mark Antony, he met no resistance. There was nobody there. And so Mark Antony, after a while, marching, mile after mile, he decided that this was basically dumb. This was a waste of time, boring. And he was really upset because Mark Antony had built up this huge force, this huge army, a huge army, one of the biggest ever at the time. And he got upset that the army was moving so slow, because you have to remember, with this huge army, all the hundreds of wagons full of supplies, he had a bunch of siege weapons to knock down the gate, to scale the walls of this city, Pharaspa. And so what Mark Antony decided is he was going to take his main force, his main soldiers, and he decided to have them go full speed ahead to get to this Parthian client kingdom's city. And he decided to leave all of his supplies, wagons, siege equipment, and all the food and grain and everything you need for an invasion. He decided to leave that behind. And he said, you guys move 2 miles an hour or 5 miles an hour, or however slow it was, and I'll see you at the enemy's capital. So Mark Antony, he left about I believe it was 2 legions. He left 2 of his legions to guard the supply wagons, the supplies, the food, the grain, the siege weapons. And also the Armenians, they were back there in the back also as a kind of rear guard in case the Parthians would try to attack from the back. So Mark Antony departs and takes most of his guys with him. They're gone. And the supplies and the wagons and the siege equipment, they're, going real slow and taking their time, having a hard time going there. And it takes them a while to get there. And so Mark Antony, he reaches this enemy capital, and he starts, getting ready for this, to lay a siege. He gets everything ready, and he's waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and wait, and he's still waiting, and nothing happens. And he says, well, a bunch of time goes by, right? And so he says, well, what happened to the supplies? Where's the supplies? Where's the siege equipment? Everything's set up. And so someone goes out there, and someone comes back and says, oh, well, everything was destroyed. There is no siege equipment. There is no more supplies, and the Armenians left. And so Mark Antony, shocked and surprised, is like, well, what do you mean? There's no more supplies. There's no the wagons. The siege equipment is destroyed. Everything is gone. What are you talking about? And the guy says, yeah, I went there and everything's destroyed. Now, what had happened is the Medians and the Parthians, once they saw Mark Antony and his main force separate from the supply wagons and the siege equipment, the Parthians and the Medians, they descended on them with all the military forces, or the Parthian army and all the guys that they had. They descended on them and wiped them out. And so now here Mark Antony is deep behind into this enemy territory. He has no siege equipment to attack this enemy fortification, this enemy the enemy walls, heavily guarded. No, he doesn't have the equipment to do it. He has no supplies. And it turns out the Armenians, one of his main guys, his main allies, once the Armenians were way, well, like you have to picture this. You have the Armenians way in the back. In the middle, you have the supply train, and then you have Mark Antony way out front. Okay, the supplies and the siege equipment got wiped out, and when the Armenians came across that, finally got to where there's just hundreds of destroyed wagons and burned down catapults and all that was, the Armenian king basically thought that maybe, well, Mark Antony's dead, or maybe the Romans got wiped out. And so the Armenians, they turned tail. They got out of there. When the Armenians saw the Parthians and stuff, they turned tail. They got out of there. They're like, we don't want this to happen to us. We don't want that to happen to us. And so the Armenians are gone. Mark Antony has no siege equipment, no supplies, deep in the enemy territory. And so Mark Antony, he's like, well, he couldn't really attack the city because he didn't have the equipment to do it. It was a disaster. And a lot of his allies had left, especially with the Armenians that made up a major portion of his force. And so for a while, Mark Antony continued this siege anyway. But as time went on and he didn't have the equipment to take the city, it ended up that one day, the Parthians showed up. Now the Parthians did not engage Mark Antony and the force that he had, but the Parthians engaged in guerrilla warfare, skirmishes, hit and run. And so Mark Antony started losing guys little by little. And what's more important, though, is Mark Antony had no food. He had no supplies for his soldiers, his guys. And so eventually, an army that doesn't have food, cannot function very well. And so what Mark Antony would do is he would send some guys out to the local forest or the local river to go fishing or so forth. And whenever he did this, the Parthians would be there waiting for him and would ambush these small numbers of guys who would go out. Plus, even doing that, even if he didn't take casualties from doing that, it just most likely was not enough to sustain a whole army, especially the force or the size of the army that Mark Antony had. Mark Antony had a huge number of guys, a huge force. And so the food runs out. And so obviously, the soldiers, when there's nothing to eat, how long are you going to be able to do that? A couple days go by, okay, there's nothing to eat. a couple more days, a couple more weeks go by. I mean, you're not going to be able to function normally without something to eat. And so Mark Antony at this point, he tried to engage the Parthians, and he tried to get the Parthians to engage his force, his army. But every time the Parthians would run away, they would have their horse archers firing arrows, and the Mark Antony, he wasn't really in a position, or didn't really have the strength left to pursue the Parthians even deeper into Parthian territory. And so this brings up an interesting point at this point. Uh, Mark Antony in Gaul, he was with Caesar, right, during the Gallic Wars. Now, Caesar had faced a similar dilemma. The Gauls had destroyed the crops, burned the farms, and tried to intercept and disrupt Caesar's supply. So one of the things Julius Caesar did is he sent out because Julius Caesar, he ran short on food at times too. There was even one point or one time where Julius Caesar, his soldiers were eating grass or weeds or whatever they could find, little leaves off the tree. You know, they didn't have a whole lot of food, and and so what Julius Caesar did is when he would send guys out to forage for food in the forest or wherever fishing, he would send whole legions out at a time. And what's amazing is Mark Antony didn't do that here, or maybe he couldn't because it was in the mountains, or he was scared of taking even more casualties from the Parthians, who were expert at archery, expert at hit and run with the cavalry. And so, if you're trying to wonder what happened, well, basically nothing happened. Mark Antony eventually he turned around and left. And that was the end of Mark Antony's invasion of Parthia. It had been a complete and total disaster. However, after Mark Antony left Parthian territory and he went back to Roman territory to regroup, resupply, and re-equip his army, uh, the Mark Antony's Parthian invasion had been a disaster, but he didn't necessarily gain nothing from it. Okay, so Mark Antony went back to Roman territory and reorganized his dudes, got supplies and basic stuff, and he was really upset at the Armenians and the Armenian king, uh, Artavasdes II of Armenia. And so later on, Mark Antony took his army and he went to the Armenian capital, Artataxta. Again, I'm probably saying that wrong. But he went to Armenia's capital, laid siege to the city, and took the king of Armenia hostage or captive, put him in chains, and took him back to I forget what it was, Roman territory. Mark Antony went back to Egypt, and Mark Antony annexed Armenia. But that was it. That was about the last thing. And of course, after taking over Armenia, he probably looted the treasury or took some gold or other valuables. And so Mark Antony was so upset that he attacked. In the end, he ended up attacking his own ally. So that was about the end. That was basically the end of that story, though. And so while Mark Antony was away in the east, uh, having his war with Parthia and the invasion that he was doing there, out west, Octavian was things were going okay for a while. Octavian was biding his time, building up his military, and one of the main things that Octavian had going for him was he was patient. He would wait and not try to do everything at once. And that also worked out for him in the end. Um, he was building up his army, building up his navy, and finally, when he was ready to go and everything was all set, then he was able to do what he wanted to do. And so, for several years, everything was all right. Everything was going good, peaceful in the West. And then, after things kind of started to break down, Octavian divorced his second wife, Scribonia, who he had been married to from 40 to 38. And then he later on married his third wife, Livia Drusilla. And things broke down between Octavian and Sextus Pompey. Um, Sextus Pompey one of his goals was to try to restore the Roman Republic, but after the Battle of Philippi, I mean, he just didn't have the military force, the military capability to do that, especially from Sicily and some of the other islands he controlled. Although he was a successful raider, and he was able to interrupt a lot of the trade and commerce, and especially the food and grain that was being moved and shipped around the Mediterranean. And so that's what he did. Uh, Rome, at the time, and also many other years and centuries later, uh, it would basically be the same thing. Rome and Italy and other places relied on grain from Egypt and Africa mainly, and it would be shipped back to Rome or other places, and that's how one of the main ways how the city of Rome and other places, other cities, and other provinces were able to exist basically. Large-scale imports of grain, wheat, cattle, and so forth, and other goods that would be shipped across the Mediterranean back to Rome and elsewhere. And so Sextus Pompey was in the perfect position, being in Sicily. He was able to almost blockade and interrupt any travel, any merchant, any ship going through or around the Mediterranean. He would be able, with his fleet, he'd be able to intercept them. Now, one of the things he tried doing was to blockade or stop these ships so that there would be famine or food shortages and other products and goods that there would be shortages of. And the idea was, if you stop the food going to Rome, supposedly the people of Rome and elsewhere would rise up and overthrow Octavian and hopefully maybe even restore the Republic. But again, by that point, it was basically a little too late. Octavian had built up his navy and built back up his army to such a point where he couldn't, in the long run, he could not outlast Octavian. He didn't have the forces necessary to do that. So relations broke down between Octavian and Sextus Pompey. Octavian had divorced Scribonia, who was the niece of Sextus Pompey's wife, a different Scribonia, also by the same name. And things just broke down, and fighting resumed. And so Octavian took his fleet and his army and went down to Sicily. But Sextus Pompey defeated Octavian. Octavian was soundly defeated. And then they had another naval engagement. And again, Octavian's fleet, his ships and naval forces, again were soundly were defeated. And so Octavian was set back, and he wasn't making any progress. He wasn't breaking through. Sicily was vitally important. He had to restore the food shipments and the grain supplies that were coming in from Egypt. Was also called the Cura Annone, which was basically the food stamps that they had 2,000 years ago. Many of the people in Rome and elsewhere relied on that grain shipment coming in from Egypt, just so that they can eat. And so Octavian had to get back Sicily, but multiple times he tried to do that, and he got defeated really badly. And so it ended up that Octavian, he sent a message to his ally, or one of the second triumvirate friends that he had. Let me see here. It was forgot his name. Lepidus. Sorry about that. Lepidus, who was down in Africa, and so Lepidus in Africa teamed up with Octavian. Lepidus raised his own army and his own navy, got his fleet and ships. And so one last time, Octavian sent his ships, sent his navy down to Sicily. And Sextus Pompey had almost everything he had into it, and it was occupied by Octavian. Meanwhile, Lepidus comes across from Africa, and boom, with his navy, Lepidus's navy and army, landed in Sicily, took the island, and Octavian at that point, Octavian's fleet, or his ships, also had victory. That was at the Battle of Nalacuas in 36 BC in Sicily, and Lepidus occupied the island. And at that point, all the harbors, all the cities were controlled by Lepidus, and so Sextus Pompey, he had nowhere to go, nowhere to land. At the last battle that Sextus Pompey had, he was able to survive and even escaped, but he tried going to Turkey or somewhere in Asia, but was captured and executed. And so that was the end of Sextus Pompey, who was the son of Pompey, or Pompey the Great, Pompey Magnus. So after this happened, Octavian basically said to Lepidus, "Well, hand over, good job, thanks for helping out, really did a number on those guys. Everything's done and over with, but you got to hand over Sicily. Let me, Sicily's going to belong to me." And Lepidus said, "No, I'm taking Sicily. Sicily is now part of my African kingdom, or African domain, and Sicily is going to belong to me." But if you remember, from earlier, when Mark Antony was defeated from the Battle of Mutina, Mark Antony went to southern Gaul, which was part of Lepidus's territory, where he was governor of. And Lepidus's own army defected or switched sides and joined Mark Antony. And well, this second time around, the same thing happened. Lepidus's soldiers, or his army, defected or switched over to Octavian. They said, we are not going to fight for you, Lepidus. We are not going to oppose Octavian. Octavian says, hand over Sicily, you got to hand it over. We're not going to, we're not going to, stay with you. So just like that, all of a sudden, after this one event, Octavian took over not just Sicily and retook the other islands, Sardinia and Corsica, but the only guy left in the west was Octavian. He even got Africa, and that was the end of Lepidus as well. So not only did Sextus Pompey go down, but Lepidus also. And so that was one triumvirate down, and now there was just two left. And Mark Antony, he was busy, and he was having a really tough time in Parthia while this was going on. And so Octavian, he was just waited as usual, was patient, and when the opportunity presented itself, all of a sudden Octavian was the sole ruler in the west, and it was just Mark Antony in the east. And so at that point, things just continued to go downhill. That was in 36 BC, where both Sextus Pompey and Lepidus went down. And over the next couple of years, things just continued to go downhill between Octavian and Mark Antony from there. I mean, you had two dictators, both who basically wanted absolute power, who both didn't like each other. I mean, even from the get-go, even from the very beginning, from the very start, Octavian and Mark Antony had problems. And once again, those problems came back again. And things basically took a couple of years before the final battle, but stuff just got worse and worse. Mark Antony basically didn't care about his marriage to Octavian's sister. Ended that relationship, and almost everybody knew about Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And Octavian was able to continually degrade and put Mark Antony into a bad light, just make him look like bad, really bad. For example, reading his will, where Mark Antony would basically reject a lot of his Roman, ideas and standing, being buried in Egypt and giving a lot of the Roman territories to Egypt or some of his kids and stuff. And it just went downhill from there. And Mark Antony, after his failed, disastrous war in Parthia, he had lost a bunch of guys, and Octavian said he was going to send Mark Antony a bunch of troops, a bunch of legions. Didn't happen. Octavian, didn't come through with his side of the bargain. And so it was stuff like that where Mark Antony and Octavian just once again were getting ready to battle it out. And it got to the point where Mark Antony did try to take over Octavian's half of the empire. And so Mark Antony went to Greece with his navy and army, and at the Battle of Actium decided to fight Octavian at sea. Now, what's weird about the Battle of Actium, is Mark Antony wasn't really known as a sailor or naval officer, yet he decided that he was going to try to win a naval victory. And it's kind of strange because here's Octavian, who just came out of a huge engagement with Sextus Pompey, and for a long time he had been doing naval engagements. He had, been able to practice and get his sailors some experience, whereas Mark Antony, he was more of an infantry guy. So it's really just kind of weird because Mark Antony had this huge army with him, but he decided not to not to use them. I mean, uh, he obviously had supply problems similar to those in Parthia, but he still could have tried to do something on land, but he chose not to do that. And Octavian and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium both used their navies, and Octavian ended up. It was even the battle itself was really unusual and strange. So Octavian, once he found out that Mark Antony was right next door and going to invade and stuff, Mark Antony had stopped in Greece. Octavian went and met him, and at the Battle of Actium, during the middle of the battle, when the battle could have gone either way, it could have gone to Mark Antony, it could have gone to Octavian, it was up in the air. Uh, but during the battle, Cleopatra had uh, gone with Mark Antony on this campaign. This was like an all or nothing throw of the dice gamble. Everything was riding on this one battle, this one engagement. And during this battle, the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra left the battle. She was on her ship, and during the fighting, obviously gaps opened up, and Cleopatra slipped out and went set sail and started going back to Egypt. And Mark Antony, when he saw Cleopatra leave the battle, uh, abandoned his own dudes, his own guys, his own sailors who were fighting and living, dying for him, and Mark Antony just abandoned the battlefield. Or the naval engagement. He just sailed away. And when his own guys, his own sailors saw that Mark Antony just didn't care, many ships had there had been a huge number of casualties at that battle, at that engagement. But once Mark Antony's own guys, his own sailors and soldiers, saw that he was, you know, turning tail and running, well, many of them gave up and surrendered to Octavian. And the land forces, most of them weren't even involved in that battle, and they ended up surrendering too to Octavian. So Mark Antony, he survived the he survived the battle, but and went and got back to Egypt. But he had at that point he had no army, he had no navy, and Egypt was a back in the day, back at 2,000 years ago, Egypt was one of the richest countries in the world, and it would have been easy for Mark Antony or Cleopatra to raise a new army or raise a new navy, but they didn't have the time because right after that battle, that's exactly where Octavian went. He went straight to Egypt and almost with no resistance took over. And of course, Mark Antony and Cleopatra died. And it's, again, another weird situation. Supposedly, Mark Antony thought that Cleopatra was dead, but she wasn't really dead. And so Mark Antony killed himself. And so even at the very end, it was weird. It was weird. And so Cleopatra, once she found out that Mark Antony thought that she was dead, she killed herself also. And so Octavian, after all this happened, he was in Egypt, and Mark Antony, after the death of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, there was no one else to rival Octavian. Uh, Many of Mark Antony's and even Julius Caesar's supposed son, Caesarion, apparently Octavian put them to death as well, so that they wouldn't challenge him for the throne. But at that point, um, Octavian was the sole ruler of the Roman world. Now, the Battle of Actium in the year 31, after that battle had taken place and Octavian uh, emerged victorious and secured his position on the throne as the first Roman emperor. What's interesting about that battle is um, Octavian, who basically almost went from nothing, went to being ruler of the known world. And as a complete dictator or a dictatorship, Octavian, being the first emperor, all the other Roman leaders after him, for the next about the next 500 years in the West and the Western Roman Empire, to 1,400 years in the East Roman Empire, were also dictators. So every Roman leader after Octavian, every Roman ruler was a dictator, and the Romans ended up with a dictatorship in the West from uh, after the Battle of Actium, and particularly before that at the Battle of Philippi, and then with the defeat of Sextus Pompey in Sicily in 42 BC and 36 BC. So from then to 476 AD in the West, 500 years, all dictatorships, all dictators. The Roman state was a dictatorship, dictator after dictator, every Roman leader. That was for 500 years, about. And then in the East Roman Empire, in the East, for another 1,400 years until 1453, when the last Byzantine emperor or the East Roman emperor was defeated. And so this time period was really crucial because never again, especially after the Battle of Philippi and also with Sextus Pompey in Sicily, never again would the Romans try to have or restore a republic. It was almost like a return to the monarchy, even though they did not call it that, where the emperor or the emperor's son or family would rule for life instead of the two consuls, which would only rule the Roman state for 1 year and then be replaced in the next election. In a yearly, every yearly election, there would be two new consuls, and also the Roman Senate, which would have a major say in matters under the Roman emperors still existed, but again, the Roman emperor or the dictator basically had almost all the power in just one person. And it would continue like that for hundreds and even thousands of years. There is also another major thing or major event uh, which resulted from the Battle of Actium, and that is after the Battle of Actium, that was the fourth major civil war that had taken place in the Roman Empire within a very short period of time. The first obviously being between Sulla and Marius, then between Pompey and Caesar, then between Octavian and Mark Antony versus Brutus and Cassius, and then finally between Octavian and Mark Antony. So you have four major civil wars within a very short amount of time. The amount of death, the huge casualties, the destruction of countless numbers of towns, villages, farmland, and the amount of wealth and other resources that would have been lost was incredible and huge, and would go on. Uh, this issue of civil war would go on and happen many times later on within the Roman world. This wasn't the last civil war, and so the Romans would continuously be plagued by civil war, and it would be one of the reasons that they would have a downfall in the end, at least in the West. Not so much in the East, although in the Eastern Roman Empire they had their fair share of civil wars. But while the Romans were fighting amongst themselves, that made it so much more easier for outside forces to pick away and able to grab territory from the Romans. But back to the subject at hand. And so, after going to Egypt, Octavian left and went back to Rome. And after rebuilding and resupplying and trying to repair so much of the damage and loss of property and land and all the casualties, um, Octavian did lead or at least order several more Roman takeovers of various areas. For example, Octavian had one of his armies go to Spain, and the Romans finished the conquest of northern Spain, and they took over the area or the land there. And also, Octavian had many of his armies push out from Greece, Illyricum, and Gaul, and he was able to take over a huge amount of territory. In 12 BC, Octavian ordered the invasion of Germany, or Germania, and had his armies take over various tribes and areas of Germany, and also many of the tribes and areas around the Danube River. And so, Octavian made Germany a Roman province. Now, the Romans originally had 11 legions in Germany, or Germania. They had a huge military presence. And the Romans were in Germany for about 20 years, from about 12 BC, of course, to until 9 AD, and then they left about 17 AD, but they weren't really there after 9 AD. It was mostly military skirmishes and guerrilla warfare going on. There was major engagements, huge major engagements, of course. So the Romans, they were in Germany. It was as one of Octavian's provinces for about 20 to 30 years. And it was during this time, in 6 AD, there was a major rebellion. Now, in an area called Dalmatia and Pannonia in Illyrium. This was also called the Great Illyrian Revolt. And this happened in 6 AD, and it took place in an area around here. Many of the tribes that Octavian had tried to conquer and take over in his push to expand the empire revolted. Many of the barbarian tribes. They did not want to be in the Roman military. They did not want to pay taxes to Rome, to have Roman law, religion, customs, and language, and so forth. And so many of them revolted. And so this was a huge rebellion too. And so this was so serious in this area. The rebellion was so serious that the Romans, who had before the rebellion, they had 11 legions in Germany, and they were getting ready to actually continue the campaigns to to continue moving east and to subjugate many of the kings and tribes or um, barbarian kingdoms that would not submit to them or join them. And so that had to be put on hold because of this rebellion. And so there was originally 11 legions, and 8 were withdrawn and sent down to the southeast to deal with this rebellion, which eventually was put down. And one of the soldiers that uh, went there was one of the German uh, warlords or aristocrats, Arminius. He served with the Romans in the army. And so the Romans were able to destroy that rebellion, and the rebellion lasted about a couple of years from 6 to 9 AD. And then Arminius went back, and he had served in the Roman army. Now, the Romans were just getting started in Germany, building roads, building temples, aqueducts, baths, arenas, that sort of thing. The typical Roman stuff. The forum, the marketplace, and so a lot was going on there. But at this point, after the Great Illyrian Revolt, most of the Roman military or the Roman army that had been in Germany was suddenly no longer there. From 11 legions stationed in Germany, there was now only 3 legions. Also, Germany got a new governor, Varus, who had been governor in several other provinces or areas. For example, Varus was also governor in Syria, and it was said that Varus got to Syria poor and left Syria rich. Um, and there was even a rebellion down in Judea, and Varus was able to put that down with some of the Syrian legions he had. And so Octavian considered Varus to be a successful governor and sent him to Germany to try to Romanize or speed up the Romanization of Germany. Now, this backfired big time because many of the Germanic tribes and Germanic people who only a couple years before had been, independent, free nations and free countries. Now they were subjugated to this, superpower, and now they're having to give up much of their customs, culture, language, many of their rights. And the Romans, while they were in Germany, basically ran roughshod over the various Germanic tribes that were there. Trying to take as much of their wealth as possible. Many of the Germanic tribes that did resist, many of the tribesmen were executed, sold into slavery, and crucifixion uh, of whole populations was not unknown to the Romans, especially during a rebellion or to people who tried to resist and revolt and try to stop the Romans. And so the Romans were really unpopular in many parts of Germany. And Arminius, who had served in the Roman army, had seen many of the atrocities that the Romans had carried out, especially during the revolt down in Illyrium and Pannonia and those areas. Uh, and so he got to see firsthand how the Romans just rode roughshod over anyone who tried to resist them. And so while the Roman takeover of an area may have had its upsides, it may have had good things, it also had some really horrible and really awful and terrible things that would go along with it. And so, since the Romans had only been in Germany for, about 10 years, 20 years, that's not a whole lot of time. Um, and so, many of the people in Germany, all the various tribes, they got together with Arminius and at Teutoburg Forest wiped out the three legions that were left and stationed in Germany. And so after Teutoburg Forest, the Germanic tribes threw out the Romans, and Arminius, who was also called Hermann, was successful at defeating the Romans. The Romans tried to recapture Germany many times over several years, but the various Germanic tribes were basically united and conducted infinite, guerrilla warfare. They did have major battles. The Romans did win many engagements, but in the end, the Romans just were not able to hold the land, to keep the land. Um, there, the guerrilla warfare would have just gone on almost indefinitely. The Romans wiped out entire areas. There was a huge amount of destruction, but in the end, the Romans just could not win in the long run because of those things that were going on. And Arminius or Hermann himself was assassinated because he tried to rule all of Germany for himself or by himself, and one of the other tribes did him in. But for many years, Octavian did not give up, and even for a while, the emperor after Octavian, Tiberius, waged constant invasions of Germany to try to take the land back. But in the end, uh, in about 17 AD, the Romans had enough, and the emperor after Octavian passed away or died, by about 17 AD, the Romans had enough, and the emperor that replaced Octavian, Tiberius, basically decided to call it quits and made the Rhine and also the Danube the limits of the Roman world. And it stayed that way for the next couple hundred years, where the Rhine and the Danube were the Roman border, basically. And that is how Octavian became emperor.